Good evening to everybody, and thank you very much for coming. I welcome you to this inaugural event of the Indian Professional Forum, an exclusive leadership forum aimed at contributing to the policy development in key socio-economic areas of concern for the Indian diaspora. Roughly half of the UK's 2 million Indian population are highly skilled professionals working in business, government, healthcare, education, technology, and other sectors. According to government statistics, the median income of this group is amongst the highest in the country. They constitute what I would say the big middle of the Indian diaspora community. Though the idea of this forum was debated over a couple of years, its formation was prompted by the result of the referendum. Brexit or no Brexit, UK will remain a destination of choice for the Indian professionals and business. Trade and investment between India and UK is vital now and for the future. UK is the single largest G20 investor in India, and India is the third largest investor in UK, creating thousands of new jobs, employing 110,000 people in 800 Indian companies with a turnover of 26 billion pounds. We seek to emphasize the contribution that this Indian diaspora community has made to the country. According to the Center for Economic and Business Research, CEBR, which is represented here, both India and UK are likely to grow rapidly from now to 2030, making India the third largest world economy. Britain's desire to seek enhanced relationship and trade with India is greater than ever before. Naturally, with the important role Indians play in the UK and the contribution they make to the society and the economy, means we should be very involved and our voices heard on the Brexit deal and what happens afterwards. The IPF provides a powerful platform for the Indian diaspora to shape the debate on issues that affect them and the nation. The future provides enormous opportunities for Indian professionals to participate in the development of both countries. IPF will also act as a focus for the important issues and catalyst for exchange of ideas for the future of partnership between our two great nations. IPF particularly aims to harness the intellectual capital of diaspora to find stimulating ideas and credible solutions to the challenges faced by India. Our survey has shown that one of the areas that is of considerable interest to the professional community is the area of technology and skills. These are challenges being faced in both countries. We hope to work with London Business School and Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, and other institutions in UK and India in sharing experiences and developing joint programs. Just as the US tech industry and Silicon Valley has 15% of its startups founded by Indians, and the big tech companies like Google, Facebook, Microsoft, Cisco, and Oracle have an Indian at one of their top positions, we expect our contribution to the UK tech scene to grow. Indian innovations, energy, and enterprise from young engineers and startups will provide a tremendous boost to the UK tech industry in the years ahead, and the opportunities for collaboration between professionals of both countries are great. To sum up, our key objective is to create a strong representation as a group, to create a big leap ideas think tank, to enhance contribution to national policy formulation, to strengthen partnership between India and UK in selected key areas, encourage the next generation, and promote personal and professional development, high-level networking. Before I conclude, I would like to thank the members of the steering group of the core founding members who worked very hard in making this happen. I'm also grateful to the High Commissioner for his support, encouragement, and particularly the Deputy High Commissioner, Ambassador Dinesh Patnaik, who has been working with us as a member of the group, and without the support of the High Commission, and we would not have been here. Finally, I thank all of you who have paid membership fees and urge others to do the same. I thank you for your attention. May I now invite the High Commissioner to address us. High Commissioner.
Is it okay? The Right Honourable Sir Vince Cable, Dr. Mohan Kaul, the President of the Indian Professional Forum, my lords, ladies, I'm delighted to be here for this inaugural function of the Indian Professional Forum this evening. When I first heard about this forum, I was very skeptical because we have a plethora of Indian diaspora organizations all over the UK, particularly in London. But when I read about what they've seek to achieve and whom they represent, I realized that there was this niche, this gap that needs to be filled, because we have, of course, business organizations and we have specific professional organizations for particular areas or fields, but a general forum of Indian professionals was something that we didn't have. So I think this is the void that this forum seeks to fill, particularly since, as you said, Dr. Kaul, that there are a very large number of Indian professionals in diverse fields across the UK, making an invaluable contribution to, of course, the UK, but also to India-UK relations. So I think this is a great opportunity to celebrate the achievements of the Indian professionals here in diverse fields, as I said, whether it's the NHS, doctors, medicines, IT-enabled services, architects, lawyers, you name it, and even in some of the cutting-edge niche technology areas where Indians have excelled. So I think this is important that we are able now to look at how the Indian Professional Forum can contribute to enhancing relations between our two countries. And that is where I think the High Commission is happy to support this initiative, because I think it's important to engage at various levels and to see how we can leverage our strengths to come up with what is there, I believe, for today, a winning partnership. The last time I spoke on a winning partnership, certain people in the FCO were not very happy. So I will now ensure I will make them happy, but just to sort of mention that a winning partnership is more than just an FTA. And that's what I've been emphasizing, because the people that are really interested in this partnership talk about an FTA around the corner, an FTA when the UK actually leaves the EU, but it's not going to be that easy. Obviously, no FTAs are easily negotiated, and you should know that. We know that certainly. We have very few FTAs in this world, especially very few in the developed world, 9 in all, if I'm not mistaken. But be that as it may, I think there's great possibility, this great political will on both sides to conclude a mutually beneficial agreement. But I don't intend talking about the FTA too much, because we still haven't even started our discussions. We have a joint working group which has met a couple of times, but there's a long way to go. We need to wait and see what the contours of your deal with the EU will be before we start serious negotiations. But on the bilateral cooperation in areas that may be of interest to you, whether it's innovation, whether it's R&D, whether it's fintech, whether it's IT, whether it's biotechnology, you name it. I mean, all the niche cutting-edge technologies, India and UK are cooperating, whether it's under the ambit of the UK IERI or the Newton Bhabha Fund. There is a great amount of work that is being done under the radar, the sort of work that doesn't really get recognized, and certainly it is not recognized publicly, and certainly doesn't hit the headlines in the media here, or in India for that matter. But there is a lot already going on, and I think some of you are probably involved in some of these very interesting, very exciting projects And in my 1 year here that I've been traveling around, I have come across some of these projects, and I'd like to mention some. There is the Sunrise project at the Swansea University. I was there in September, and it was wonderful to see a team of dedicated researchers, scientists, people working on solar energy with their partners and counterparts from India in developing renewables and developing solar energy as an alternative to fossil fuel. You're aware that India has taken the lead in the Paris Climate Agreement and the talks, the summit held in Paris about solar energy, and the International Solar Alliance is actually led by France and India, the former President Hollande and Prime Minister Modi. And a great deal of emphasis is being paid to developing solar energy. And the mix in India is changing and changing rapidly. So I think it's important that we recognize such efforts, whether it's in solar energy or whether it's the Clean Ganga project, where again, apart from the research, there has also been attempts to try and see how we can bring in a holistic approach to clean the Ganges River, which is, of course, a priority of this government. But there are other areas where we have been working together, whether it's Skill India or Make in India. These are the flagship projects and programs of Prime Minister Modi and his government, for which we obviously need international partners, and I think UK is ideally placed to provide that partnership. And the UK is already committed to smart cities in the new capital of Andhra Pradesh, Amravati, in Indore and in Pune. But apart from that, there are other areas where we have been collaborating quite closely. But one area where I think, and I'm sure all of you probably know more than I do about this area, is the digital era. The digital era, how digital India is actually transforming the landscape there. You've all heard of demonetization, and you've all heard of the rollout of the GST. There has been uniform criticism abroad, at least in the UK. I haven't yet come across a really sensible piece on the fallout of these two really disruptive measures taken by government. But when I was in India, and I was in India for 3 weeks, and I just got back Sunday, I saw how things are changing there. And that goes largely unreported. Recently, I read an article by Arvind Gupta and Philip Oswald in the Harvard Business Review. It's called Digital First Economy. I would suggest that you read it. It talks about the digitalization in India and what the effects of these two revolutionary measures, demonetization and the rollout of the GST, have done. Now, obviously, India being a democracy, we are very responsive to the views and the reactions of the people. So that is why you see the rollout of the GST being adjusted, rationalized, depending on the experience of that rollout. After all, we never had an experience of a one tax, one country, one tax. And this government really took that initiative. There obviously have been hitches, and there will be glitches, any such big measure. But I think the way the government is adjusting and the way it is responding to not only just criticism, but also suggestions is remarkable. So I think what this government has achieved is, in my opinion, truly revolutionary. And the digitalization of the economy is not limited to these two measures. I mean, there is a term some of you IT people certainly have heard of called India Stack, a four-layered transformation taking place. At the base is the identity layer, the Aadhaar, the UID. Then it's the documentation layer, and then the payment layer, and of course, the transaction layer. And that is transforming India, ladies and gentlemen, not just in the cities, but all over. In October last year, there were 100,000 such digital transactions taking place. This year, that number rose to 76 million. Truly astounding. And I think, obviously, the idea is not to go completely cashless, but certainly less cash. And that's what's happening in India. And I think those of you involved in the financial sector or in the IT sector or the fintech sector, which offers so much possibility, this is the time that you should be collaborating and looking at India and what you can do together with your counterparts there. So I think what is happening now is the government, and the proof of the pudding obviously in the elections in any democracy. We will see what happens in the upcoming elections, and of course the general elections in 2019, and I'm nobody to prejudge the outcome. But all I can say is that the efforts being made by this government to radically transform the Indian economy is bearing fruit. It will take time. We are a nation of 1.25 billion people, and obviously when such disruptive measures, such innovative, revolutionary measures are taken, there will be, as I said, glitches, but more important, it takes time in the medium to long term to really realize the benefits of these moves that the government has taken. But I am sanguine that what the government is doing, the direction that it is headed, the reforms that it's initiated, and of course there's much more to be done, will ensure that India, the Indian economy, will grow rapidly in the coming years. It has been growing quite fast. After all, we were the fastest growing, and still are perhaps the fastest growing large economy in the world. But I think we will continue to do so with more accelerated growth in the time to come because of some of these reforms that have been initiated by the government. On the bilateral front, I think the India-UK partnership, we have to do much, much more. You'd be surprised to hear that the UK is the 15th largest trading partner of India. I couldn't believe that when the stats came in. When I came here last year, it was the 12th, and now it's the 15th. And that is per our statistics, the Indian government statistics. Trade has fallen by about 12.2%. Trade in goods has fallen 12.2%. Indian exports have fallen 3%, but what's really astounding is that UK's exports to India has fallen nearly 30%. But be that as it may, the relationship is not just a simple trade in goods. If you include services, obviously the picture is different. In 2015, it was estimated that 4.9 billion pounds of services were traded by both sides. And apart from trade in services and goods, the investment picture again is actually quite promising. UK was the largest G20 investor into India and the third largest overall after Mauritius and Singapore, but the largest G20 till recently, with a cumulative investment by UK companies into India since about April 2000 of about $24.59 billion. Japan has recently overtaken UK as the largest G20 investor into India, and that's because of the spate of investments that have happened from Japan into India in the last 2 years. And I'm sure once the UK and the British companies get some clarity on Brexit, I'm sure India will again, or UK will again be one of the top, if not the top, but certainly among the top 2 or 3 investors into India. And that's on the investment side. I did talk briefly about R&D, innovation, etc., so I'm not going to repeat myself there, except that what's happening there is also truly exciting. So when we look at a winning partnership, we need to see all the facets of the partnership, the cooperation that we have, and what we can do in the future. And I think in the future, it's professionals like you, apart from obviously big investors, that will actually lay down the contours of the relationship or of the winning partnership. And the winning partnership, as I said earlier, has to be mutually beneficial. It can't be a one-way street. For instance, going back to the FTA, and I promised not to talk about it, but you've all read about issues of freer mobility of professionals. That is something right up there as far as India is concerned. Just yesterday, I was at a brainstorming on the forthcoming CHOGM, and the people were talking about the Commonwealth Advantage. And of course, you're probably aware that the Commonwealth Advantage is defined as the common language, the English language, the rule of law, democracy, etc., etc. But what I did was I twisted around and said the Commonwealth Advantage shouldn't be only this. The Commonwealth Advantage should include freer movement of people and of professionals, and especially with the UK leaving the European Union, I think it's time to recognize, and I'm not talking about unfettered access, I'm not talking about unrestricted travel, I'm talking about movement of professionals, movement of doctors, IT specialists, technicians, engineers, etc. And I think both sides will benefit by this sort of exchange. And obviously it has to be a two-way exchange, not just one way. So I think these are important aspects of what could be a winning partnership in 2030. I do hope we have that winning partnership much before 2030, but certainly by 2030, when India would be perhaps the third largest economy in the world, it would be a great time to introspect, to pause and see where the relationship is headed. But I am confident that between now and 2030, you will already see the emergence of this winning partnership. With these words, I'd like to congratulate the Indian Professional Forum for its formation and this inaugural function. And I'd like to assure you the support of the High Commission as much as we can help you in achieving your objectives. And thank you very much for inviting me to this inaugural function. Thank you.
Thank you, High Commissioner, for those words, and thank you for giving us an overview of already the initiatives that are taking place, and we will probably work on some of them complemented digitization we're talking about with the London Business School and others, because just to understand, share of experiences from here and there. A number of initiatives that you are, there would be interest in the, as I said, this is a professional group, and we would like to take advantage of their expertise, both for India and for India. Now I have the pleasure of introducing Vince Cable, who's a very good friend. We've been colleagues for a number of years. And he is, I think in my way, the most well-known politician, British politician of India. In India, he was a son-in-law of India. So, he knows India as much as he knows Britain. So I wouldn't have found any better politician than Vince Cable to launch this new initiative for us. Vince.
Well, thank you very much for your invitation, and it's it's a lovely occasion, and I feel sort of quite sentimental about being here. I used to work in this institution, had 2 very productive years here, and this is a subject area I do feel strongly about. As Mohan has pointed out, I do have a long association. It would be ludicrously pretentious to say that I know India. I don't. India, of course, is a vast place, and there are large parts of India I've never been to. But I did go over 50 years ago, and I've been going back regularly since as a economist and a politician and minister and as a business executive and, as you say, a son-in-law and most recently as a novelist. So I do have a interact on various levels. But I'm intrigued by the approach here, the kind of forward-looking attempt to think about scenarios and also to try to brand the relationship. My initial reaction is a little bit cynical because politicians are very good at reinventing the wheel. And I remember vividly one of the first week in the coalition cabinet back in 2010, David Cameron had this bright idea of getting some of the senior ministers in the government, which included George Osborne, William Hague, myself, and 1 or 2 others, and we were all directed to a jumbo jet and sent off to India to create what I think they called a winning partnership. I've forgotten what the slogan was, but it was something very, very similar. I'm not sure what there is to show for it, but it was a powerful statement of a potential relationship which we had neglected and needed to rebuild. But reflecting on it, I've always felt that the best place to start is not from history. I mean, clearly there is a historical link, a very strong one, between Britain and the Indian subcontinent, but it's obviously controversial and people have very different views about it, not all of them flattering about the role of the UK. So I think probably history isn't the best place to start. It's the best place to start with a combination of mutual respect and mutual interests. And, you know, there clearly are mutual interests. I think the High Commissioner has spelt out very well what they are, and some surprisingly important ones, and some surprisingly unimportant ones. I had realized that British trade to India has fallen quite dramatically, at least in terms of goods, to almost to an embarrassing degree. But when you talk about investment flows, it's a very different story, and it isn't just that British companies form a major part of what is foreign investment in India, but equally very large flows of Indian investment in the UK. A lot of British people are still surprised when you tell them that our largest manufacturing company is Tata. I think that's still true even after the divestment of steel. But you know, Indian companies are, it isn't just one big one, but a very, very large number of Indian investors are involved here in the manufacturing sector, in financial services and elsewhere, quite apart from the diaspora. So there are already very strong mutual interests. But in terms of the question you've posed, which is this interesting one about where will we be in 2030, I think it's important, I think, to get a sense of how quickly things are already moving. Before I became a Member of Parliament, I was in Shell's group planning. I was their chief economist, and we did scenario planning, which is a very good, disciplined way of thinking about the future, which is to say, you know, what do we think will happen, but what do we think could happen, and to have plausible stories of the future. And when I was there, one of the scenarios that we played with was to ask to pose the question about the potential importance of the big emerging powers. And think that this was 25 years ago. And we did a thought experiment, which is to say, well, let's imagine a world in which over the next 25 years, i.e. to 2017, the rich world, you know, America, Europe, Japan, continues to grow at about 2% a year, which is the historic norm, roughly. And let's imagine that the emerging markets economies, led by China, India, Brazil, then Russia, grow collectively by about 6% a year. Compound interest is a very powerful thing over 25 years. And what we anticipated as a result of that thought experiment is that in 2017, China would then have the biggest economy in the world, and India would be the third. And actually, that's where we are. Of course, it depends how you measure these things, but certainly in terms of purchasing power, China has now overtaken the United States in terms of size, and India is number 3. So it isn't a question of 2030. We're dealing with now, the reality of now. And I think the question for this discussion is what happens if we extrapolate forward another decade and a half and ask what will happen if something broadly like these trends continue. I'm not going to say a great deal about India. The people in the audience are much closer to that. But you can certainly envisage 2 very plausible stories about India, one of which is that the reforms that this government in India are putting through, they work. India's already at various stages in the last couple of decades grown at roughly 9%, I think 10% one year. And supposing that all gels and the Indian economy grows at 8-9% a year for the next 15 years. I mean, total transformation in living standards, lifting people out of poverty, and the sheer scale of the country. I mean, you could have a different story in which these reforms don't work, in which the economy nonetheless continues to expand, maybe 5%, something like that. It's troublesome because that's not fast enough to absorb all the young people coming through with population growth. But nonetheless, even somewhere between 5 and 9% a year, you still have an economy that's expanding very rapidly. And it's very difficult to, on almost any scenario of the future, to think of the UK or the other developed countries growing at anything remotely like that. So the disparity in size, economic size, is going to get bigger and bigger. And in 2030, it is very difficult to envisage a world in which China is any other than by far the largest economy in the world. And something could go wrong on these, you can't always extrapolate from the past. And that India will be very comfortably the third largest economy in the world, which has massive implications for commodity markets, for patterns of trade, for flows of investment. So I won't try to say anything more about how India could evolve, that say the meeting can do that. But I would say a little bit about the UK, because I think we're unfortunately in a period of maximum uncertainty. I mean, Britain was a country where you may have liked it or disliked it, but you could be reasonably sure where you were. And now we're in a period of enormous uncertainty. Of course, the big question is around Brexit. I am probably one of the minority of people who believe it's still a question of if rather than when, but let's assume for the moment it does happen. Then there is big uncertainty about what form it takes. I mean, there are two broad views even within the cabinet, one of which is that I think is broadly the view of the Prime Minister and the Chancellor and the Business Secretary and others, I think I'm reading them correctly, which is that we should try to stay as close as possible to the European Union in terms of its trading arrangements and regulatory standards while actually leaving it. But there's another group who want to sever all links, or as many as possible, and have a very loose relationship, such of the kind that we currently have with countries like Canada. They're very, very different stories of the future. They've got very, very different implications. And they've got different implications in terms of how Britain sees its relationships with the rest of the world. And in terms of the relationship with the rest of the world, you can again envisage a whole variety of outcomes. I mean, if we'd had this discussion a year ago, or a little bit more than a year ago, I think we'd have all assumed that Britain was a pretty outward-looking place, and that may continue, but it may not. There is currently a high level of openness to investment, both financial flows and real fixed investment. I would think that probably continues, but we don't know. There is a growing anxiety about so-called security. Legislation is coming for vetting of foreign investment on security grounds. I think it's mainly directed at China, but who knows? It could be part of a new approach to looking at things in a different way. Openness in relation to people is a very, very much more difficult question, because a lot of the people who voted for Brexit voted for it to keep people out, not to be inclusive and open. Whether that materializes, I don't know. I mean, I was involved in the campaign. I don't want to reopen all the debating points, but just as a matter of fact, a lot of the diaspora community voted Brexit because they told there would be more visas. Whether that happens, we don't know. So there is an issue about degrees of openness, and it's already caused difficulties. I wasn't a fly on the wall in the meetings, the two meetings between Mrs. May and her opposite number in the last 18 months. But I'm told they were not good meetings. That the British said, can we have more access to your market for financial services and spirits and various other things? And the answer was, well, fine, providing we have more visas for students and skilled workers, to which the British answer was, well, sorry, we're not into that anymore, at which point the negotiations sort of ground to a halt. And I think that's where we are, but I'm not absolutely sure. So we don't know about openness. The other big uncertainty is, if we're looking ahead to 2030, what are the big things that the British will be doing? I mean, at the moment, you can identify certain areas where Britain has real areas of strength and competitiveness. Advanced manufacturing is one, notably aerospace. Financial services, certainly another. Creative industries, I think, another. It may be that in 15 years' time, we're dealing with the same combination of things, but advanced manufacturing is in some difficulty, and particularly the changes taking place in Europe will certainly have dramatic effects on the car industry and the aerospace industry. We can't predict. The financial services centre, I would imagine, will grow and flourish, whatever happens around Brexit, but again, we can't be completely sure. So I think the point I would want to make is that Britain is at a major historical juncture, and how we approach the rest of the world in terms of trade, investment, flows of people, is a big, big uncertainty. And I think anybody dealing with us will be painfully aware of that. Of course, there is a powerful school of thought in the opposition in the UK, which is summarised in the phrase socialism in one country. I mean, that may or may not materialise. I think it's unlikely, but there is a school of thought that that's where we ought to be heading. And there are other people who want to head in exactly the opposite direction and have a completely libertarian environment here. So anyway, the simple point is looking at the future, very, very, very uncertain. But that doesn't stop us thinking about it, building relationships, that's what we're here for. And I think there are a lot of very, very good relationships around business, universities, families, that we need to be developing. And whether we call it winning partnership or something else, I want to encourage it. So thank you for hearing me, and look forward to discussion.
Thank you for your remarks. And immigration, high skilled immigration will certainly be an issue to come for the next months and years to come, because I think that professionals here are looking forward to contributions there, and the issue of looking at high skilled migration skills both ways would be a. Thank you very much. Thanks for both of you to come here and to launch this initiative, and we hope we'll work with you for over the years for some of these issues on the bilateral between India and UK. Now this closes the first part of the panel. Please, could you come and sit there?